Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining me and Harold Offeh in conversation this evening. I'm George, the co-curator of Joy and Tranquility exhibitions alongside Laurie Britton-Newell. I'll be your facilitator tonight. My pronouns are he and him, and I'll start with a brief audio description of myself for anyone who would find it useful. I'm a white man with short brown hair and have reading glasses, wearing a grey shirt with a blue jacket, and I'm in my office at home with some books behind me. For those not familiar with Wellcome Collection, we're a free museum and library in London that explores health and what it means to be human, making connections across science and medicine, life and art. In tonight's event, we will be watching a screening of The Joy Inside Our Tears by Harold Offeh and his installation in the Joy exhibition. Then you can listen to a conversation between Harold and myself for about 20 minutes, followed by a Q&A for another 20 minutes, and we'll wrap up around 8 p.m. We will discuss the inspiration behind the piece, including Harold's interest in collective dance and its complex relationship to traumatic histories, from queer communities of colour in the 90s to danceathons during the AIDS crisis to medieval dancing plagues. We'll also talk about what it was like working on the commission about collective joy during a national lockdown. The exhibition Joy explores a diversity of uplifting experiences and the effect of positive emotion on the body. The exhibition brings together historic artefacts commissioned by Harold, Amalia Pica and David Shrigley. Joy sits alongside the exhibition Tranquility in Gallery 1. It explores calmer forms of positive emotion such as reverie and solitude. Both exhibitions sit within the wider On Happiness season, which rethink what it means to feel good and reclaim happiness for our times. So before I continue, I'll just do some housekeeping for everybody. The event is being recorded and will be available to watch again on Wellcome Collection's YouTube channel. Your cameras and microphones will be off, but hopefully you'll be able to see and hear us. We have a live speech to text provided by VoiceBox. You can access captions via the link shared in the chat box now, and they'll open up in a separate window. This event is British Sign Language interpreted, and our interpreters tonight are Michelle and Russell, who will take it in turns to interpret what is discussed in BSL. We will be audio describing this event. The host and speakers will describe themselves as key visual elements that they refer to. This is an interactive event, and we'd love to hear from you throughout. You can chat, comment, and ask questions for the Q&A in our YouTube chat. You do need to be signed into YouTube for this, but you can also ask questions and comment without signing into YouTube via Slido. We can't be together in the same room right now, but it's lovely to connect with you all on the internet. So why not give a shout out to us now and tell us where you're coming in from and where you're based. And of course, tonight we want everyone to have a positive experience, and we want everyone to create a safe space for people to share their ideas. So please enjoy the chat function responsibly and respectfully. For more on this, please see the messages from our moderating team in the chat and in the event description. If you're struggling with the platform or have any questions, please comment in the chat box of Slido, and our Wellcome Collection moderators will get in touch. So, without further ado, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Harold Offeh and to be in conversation with him tonight. Harold is a UK-based artist working in a range of media, including performance, video, photography, learning, and social arts practice. Harold is interested in the space created by inhabiting or embodying histories, using humour to confront the viewer with historical narratives and contemporary culture. He's exhibited widely in the UK and internationally, and recently completed a PhD exploring the activation of Black album covers through performance. He's a tutor in contemporary art practice at the Royal College of Art. So, Harold, would you like to audio describe yourself quickly?
Yes, hello. I'm Harold Offeh, and I'm a middle-aged black man with a beard. I'm wearing a black baseball cap and a red jacket and an orange shirt, and I'm in a room surrounded with bookshelves and slightly dying plants.
Brilliant, thank you, Harold. So we're going to start by showing a 7-minute film of Harold's Joy Inside Our Tears installation. And An audio description of the film is available on our website, so please find the link on YouTube or the Slido chat. And Harold, do you want to briefly introduce the film and just give a kind of quick audio description of the film, and then we'll go into the film?
Yeah, the film is kind of in two sections. There's a short clip from a video element that is in the installation, and this video features 4 performers, each in separate spaces, and each of them are dancing, and they include me performing. And this is just a short extract from a longer video, which is about an hour long, actually 40 minutes long, sorry, correction. And the second half of the clip that you'll see is documenting the installation. So the installation at Wellcome Collection, and it'll show you elements of the video installation, which is multi-screened. It will show you elements of images that are placed around the room, on floors, on walls, and they're stills of the performers who are also in the video. There's also a soundtrack as well, and the soundtrack sort of starts off quite slowly, quite mournfully, and then moves into a rhythmical section. So there are beats that are beginning to be sort of played.
Brilliant. So we're going to just talk about the film now, and I'm going to ask Harold some questions and kind of guide us through the kind of process of the commission. I really just wanted to start at the beginning and sort of thinking about, we've been working on this project probably over 2 years now, haven't we, when we started the original conversations, I think going back to autumn 2019. And Harold, I've known your work for a number of years before that, and I've always been a huge fan. And I wanted to just briefly mention kind of the genesis of the invitation was when I went and visited Turf Projects in Croydon and saw your project there, Croydon Plays, It Plays Itself. And what I loved about the work and your practice was your ability to bring other voices into your practice and your kind of collaboration with different communities to kind of interrogate marginal histories. And we felt like this would be a perfect commission, and your practice would suit this exhibition really well. So I wanted to ask, my first question is, when we approached you with this idea of doing a show about happiness, what your original response to that was?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Hello. Well, firstly, thank you, George, and Laurie as well, for the invitation to respond to happiness. I think I was a bit surprised. I kind of wasn't quite sure about the framing of this quite big exhibition, big ambitious exhibition. So yeah, I think to sort of think about how I might find a way into it. But I think one of the things that I think I really enjoyed about the process is, I mean, this is not to sort of suck up to you, George, but like the generosity and openness of the conversation. And I feel like the work has kind of emerged from an ongoing conversation with yourself, with Laurie, with eventual collaborators. And you very generously sort of shared that research that you and Laurie had already done in terms of the show and formulating the show. And I think I just latched on to some of those elements that I felt connected to. And one of the starting points was, this sort of history of dancing plagues, dancing manias in the medieval period, and this image of, I think it's like a copy of a Bruegel image of these women being, these medieval peasant women, for want of a better word, being restrained while they're in the sort of rapture. Literally, there are two men on either side of these three women sort of carrying them off. And I think that, in addition to, I think, some really helpful reading suggestions, so there were some quite fundamental texts that I ended up looking at, Barbara Ehrenreich's Dancing in the Streets and Lynn Siegel's Radical Happiness were sort of starting points, really, for thinking about kind of collective joy. And then moving on to going into the archive. I mean, I love an archive, and the Wellcome Library has just amazing, rich amount of material. And being able to see that image of these peasant women. So I began to sort of make connections through these elements, these artifacts. And I think it just sort of posed questions, really, in terms of thinking about kind of social dance in particular, and really thinking about the conditions of social dance, but also a relationship, I think, to trauma and traumatic histories, or I don't know, structures of oppression. And I think that's a narrative that I very much drew out from looking at these histories of medieval dancing plays to begin with, in the sense that it seemed to me there was a kind of often a link to echoes of trauma of, the bubonic plague and its devastation on communities, and that then might manifest itself in these actions. And then that there were some very vivid descriptions. John Waller's A Time to Dance, A Time to Die sort of like focuses on this very specific case of a woman in the 16th century in Strasbourg, Frau Trofia, who is is dancing for days, and then these very graphic descriptions that come from the legal documents, because it was illegally it was recorded by the authorities. And it struck me there was something really interesting as well about how the authorities were really fearful of this woman, and also of women, you know, moving and dancing. And it just got me thinking really about the sort of like social dance as resistance, as transgression, as a form of agency. And I then went off into sort of trying to kind of map these other historical instances of that. I was like, where else has that happened through social dance and collectives and groups of people? And again, there were some things in the archive. So these really amazing posters of AIDS, HIV, danceathon, these sort of fundraisers that the queer community, predominantly in the States, but held in the early 90s to raise money for HIV AIDS charities, often in the absence of, you know, governmental support, particularly in America. I mean, also here as well, but it's a way of the community through the, you know, the club scene and partying, but with a directed kind of sort of focus. So that kind of community activism I thought was really interesting. And then going back, those AIDS danceathons have a relationship to the 1920s in America, with these dance marathons where sort of Depression era America, these couples in the 20s and 30s are competing in these contests for the last couple standing, you know, dancing again for hours and days. And that becomes a spectacle for people to come and watch, these couples kind of clinging on. You know, the Hollywood film They Shoot Horses kind of depicts, you know, the insanity of that. And again, it's sort of like the contest and the spectacle, but with this economic devastation, social devastation is the sort of background to that. And then some other trajectories, thinking through like my own personal family history, experiences of Ghanaian funerals. Again, there's a common thread through all of this, which is duration, I think, and what happens over time. And Ghanaian funerals often take days. And dancing is a kind of like central element within that, you know. People, you know, mourning and celebrating are kind of intertwined. And then I found this clip on the BBC World News of this guy, Benjamin Edu, who's created a troupe of dancers who will dance. You can pay them and they'll come to the funeral and they'll dance with the coffin. And there's like routines that they kind of do. And it was interesting, this became a kind of meme, and it became like a kind of a sort of viral phenomena. But for me, what was really interesting was that it was very decontextualized. I think people didn't really understand, just seemed like a trivial spectacle, like these crazy Ghanaian people dancing with coffins. Whereas actually, I think it comes out of a much more, for me, quite sophisticated relationship with mourning and trauma, is this idea of the place of collectivity and dance and movement, you know. And, you know, what this guy's just doing is kind of, in a way, just acting like a cheerleader. It's kind of emerging from a history and a kind of culture that, and I think all of that together, I think, for me, speaks to the idea of the complexity of an emotion like joy, and how really, I think throughout this process, I've kind of felt like I haven't really had the language. Like, I feel like there's a kind of poverty of discourse around joy and pleasure. I think happiness is problematic in the way that it's often framed, particularly in the West. But yeah, that's a kind of sort of initial narrative of the research. And then, sorry, I'm going on a bit. I don't know if you want
that's
to
fine. I mean, it's really interesting, and there's so much to talk about. I mean, I guess my question coming back to you there's lots of questions I have, but how is happiness problematic in the way that it's framed?
Oh, I think, I mean, I think, well, I mean, I think what's interesting is to really think about, I've been sort of reading Sarah Ahmed's The Promise of Happiness, which I think is another text publication, and she kind of goes into really thinking about the origins, the etymology of the word happiness, and really thinking about it almost as a kind of enlightenment project within Europe, and it kind of, the humanism of really thinking about, I guess, a kind of sort of secular world, what determines the kind of quality of one's life, and I think there's a real intellectual inquiry and inquisitiveness into sort of framing this particular emotion, happiness. How is that constituted? And Sarah Ahmed really talks about like this idea of happy objects, so that things are kind of framed through objects. And it's interesting, the Enlightenment is that period of the Industrial Revolution. It's that, the age of revolutions. It's a real challenge to kind of order. And you see that notion of kind of, what does it mean to be happy, content, educated, fulfilled within a society, and how does a society support that? And you see that in the age of revolution in Europe, particularly with, the America and the Declaration of Independence, where happiness is baked into that, the pursuit of happiness as an aspiration, even though this is a slave society, so the contradictions are kind of baked in. You can see that as well with, the French Revolution as well, and some of those kind of utopian ideals. But all of that is also then developed, I think, side by side with this idea of capitalism. And for me, happiness is often transactional, it seems, or, even the kind of framing of like the pursuit of happiness, it's kind of like, it seems dependent on or contingent on, a series of circumstances. And if we think about how, sort of capitalism frames our kind of like day-to-day existence, it's dependent on a series of things, you pass your exams, there's this idea that you establish a career, and then there's an expectation of, you have to be in a relationship. There is, I mean, I'm generalizing massively, but there are these kind of culturally inscribed markers. People assume if you're not in a relationship, then maybe you're not happy. That's the kind of, and then sort of childhood, it goes on, parenting and other things. So, yeah.
You've gone right in at the deep end. You're going.
Sorry.
No, it's fantastic. You're covering all of the big topics. I mean, they are big. Curating the show was, I would say, it was Laurie and I said we met our match with this one because it's such a big topic and big question. I wanted to sort of zoom out slightly and think about the process of working on the commission. So what you talked about, your research and kind of your journey through that, and your initial proposal was fantastic. Obviously, we were right in the production mode of the exhibition in sort of spring 2020, and COVID hits. So my question is, how did that affect that in a kind of practical sense, but also how did it affect it in a kind of conceptual sense?
Yeah, I mean, the development of the work, I think, really changed pre-pandemic. I mean, what I forgot to say was that I was really interested in, all this research. I was really interested in how, I wasn't always quite sure how that would be presented to an audience. And so something I became interested in was this idea of really thinking of like an embodied approach, or really thinking about somehow taking elements, so this idea of the collective bodies in space, duration, movement, and exploring that and almost workshopping that. So, I mean, I've used workshops quite a lot in my sort of practice in collaborating. And, the prime idea was to get a group of performers into a studio and to explore some of these elements in terms of thinking about movement and duration. And and to record that and somehow negotiate that and think about how what that might be kind of presented. And that became difficult, just because of the pandemic, and that notion of physical proximity became really problematic. So the work had to evolve, and I think there just became a moment where there'd been these multiple delays, and I'd been sort of trying to hold this space where we might do something in person, and it just felt we had to kind of lean into the circumstances. I mean, talking to you, George, just felt okay. The work is being made in this time. It has to maybe speak to the conditions of this time, as opposed to a previous era that's now gone. So yeah, we ended up making the work in under lockdown conditions, and I really have to at this point really speak to the amazing collaborators, the group of people that I worked with. So and a really important starting point was working with Vanya Gala. Dr. Vanya Gala is an amazing artist, choreographer, and just really having some really interesting conversations and exchanges around practice. And Vanya was super helpful with thinking about this idea of scoring and coming up with instructions or prompts or provocations that would somehow structure the activity that would happen in the workshop. And together we developed that, and then just a really amazing set of performers, Eben Sadipo, Samra Mayanja, and Veronica Cordova de la Rosa, who you saw in that kind of clip. I mean, they're all amazing artists within themselves. They all have rich performance practices, and it was really great to kind of work with them, to really think through also their experiences of kind of performance, and that sort of was a kind of core collective through the process of kind of filming. And we over 2 days with Vanya in Portugal, in Coimbra, everyone in their own spaces. I think Samara was in Leeds, and Veronica was in Oxford, I was in Cambridge, and Eben was in London, and we all had our own kit, so sort of like have our little kind of mini studio, but we were kind of connected through Zoom, and through Zoom we could always see each other and hear Vanya and see Vanya. So there was this kind of sort of relationship, and we went through these series of scores together over those 2 days, and then that was all documented. I mean, just to speak to some of the other collaborators, Eloise Calandra, who's an amazing artist, background in photography, who really helped to shape some of the visual elements and helped me really to think through the installation. I think it was really sort of pivotal in the kind of exhibition design and photographic stills element. And then Zana, who's an amazing sound designer, who developed this amazing sound design that I think really holds the space and creates a really kind of vivid architecture, and I think really responded to some of the elements within the workshop that came out of us doing these scores.
And Harold, because as I was saying, when in all of your work there's kind of collaborative elements, why is collaboration so important to you?
I mean, I think my practice is very much framed by learning. For me, it's about pedagogies, facilitating my own learning, and creating a platform for other people's learning, shared learning. And I think, collaboration and collectivity are just about making that very visible. I mean, I'm not, you know, I think there are power dynamics that happen in collaboration. I think often there's an assumption that, oh, it's just inherently good, you're collaborating. But I think for me, particularly with this project, because I think it had been looking about the sort of power of gathering and what does it mean for people to share and exchange and just do something together. That felt really important. And I felt there was an opportunity as well with this commission, the whole process of kind of working with Welcome and yourself, unlike a lot of commissions before, I felt like, I had a lot of time, and then I had a lot of time with the pandemic. So I think I really wanted to push this idea of kind of being able to work with, different artists and see what might kind of come out of that, and really think through, for example, there's a whole installation aspect, that kind of has arisen with this work. So there was an opportunity, I think. Yeah.
I'm going to ask another question, and then in about 5 minutes, I think I'm going to give it over and see if there's any questions from the audience, because I'm sure there's plenty of people that are interested to talk to you, Harold. So I was wondering, you talked a lot about collaboration and community, and I was wondering whether the sort of situation of COVID with kind of physical isolation and physical distancing, like how that impacted or changed your thinking around community.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sort of shapes, everyone's, the denial and absence of kind of these social interactions, I think sort of heightened, our sense of their value. It's like Joni Mitchell says, you don't know what you've got till it's gone, right? So yeah, I mean, I think I've sort of been aware of kind of community structures, and then obviously that didn't completely disappear. There were emergent strategies, these mediated communities that formed, through the social events, DJing. In a panel discussion we've got tomorrow, we've got Queer House Party, or a really amazing collective that have been, have set up some really interesting structures throughout lockdown and post-lockdown now. So I think there's some really interesting emergent sort of cultures. I think they're already there, but I think they became, part of a more dominant narrative through people's experience. But also I think there's another interesting sort of community forming thing in, literally millions of people having a similar experience. That thing of like having these conversations about what people did during lockdown, it's kind of like there's a kind of that shared situation, how did people cope, how did people survive, how did, what sort of happened, that in a way is sort of like a kind of community form in itself.
Yeah, I think that sense of bonding was something that came up quite a lot in our conversations, and one thing I kept on trying to change the language around social distancing to physical distancing. And actually, what does it mean to create kind of moments of social intimacy? And I think your installation does that to a certain extent. So I was wondering whether you could talk about the kind of configuration. We've got a little bit more time before we open it up to the audience, but to talk about the configuration and what you're trying to do there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember very early on being interested in this idea of having the audience navigate and encounter the work. And I think we had some very early conversations where I was like interested in the idea of like live performance in the gallery and how that could be, or demonstrations of sort of movement, and as that evolved to recorded, I still wanted to play with this idea of kind of encountering bodies moving, but with your body also moving through space. So yeah, this idea of a kind of like multi-screen, and each screen would almost like kind of represent a body. You'd have one body on a screen, and then the audience would navigate their way around that. So that's been very much a kind of core of the work. And it's sort of evolved in terms of this installation to really thinking about, I think, the arrangement of the space, partly echoing what I felt was some of the structures of doing the scores. So like a kind of key element of the installation is like the 4 screens that are kind of arranged in not a circle, but they're kind of facing each other, that sort of form like what feels like a circle. So the audience has to position itself in relation to the screens. It's almost like you're sort of joining this conversation. And the way it's edited is that the performers are doing similar scores, their interpretations of similar scores at the same time, like dancing to their favorite song, or we did this really interesting score of sort of we had 5 ways of playing dead, so I wanted to position the audience in relation to some of these things. And then there are these images that are still images that are taken from the video that are like placed across the architecture of so on the floor or on the wall. And again, Eloise was really, really super helpful, I think, in thinking through the possibilities of that. And again, that became for me, an idea of really thinking about articulating kind of these movements and gestures that had occurred. So you have some figures sliding down the wall, and that's replicated in the position of the photographs. And I'm always interested in this idea of like movement and stillness. So, and seeing those two things. And there are multiple speeds that are happening in the installation as well.
This leads in nicely to the first question from our audience. I'm going to read it out because it's coming up into my chat box. So, have your feelings about dance and movement changed over the last 18 months? That's the second question here from the same person. What are you most excited about doing next? So I guess the first question is what your feelings about dance, and how have your feelings about dance and movement changed over the last 18 months?
I think I've just got a kind of greater sense of the agency, particularly of social dance, that kind of informal dancing. People, I feel like I'm sort of generalizing, people have different relationships to dance, I always find it weird when people say they can't dance. Because I think everybody can dance. It's just, if you can move, you can dance. I think often what people are talking about is technique, like, and that has a particular value, which I enjoy. I enjoy watching it, I enjoy learning. But it like movement and dance and, I guess, we haven't talked about somatic practices, but that sense in which of like embodied knowledge is just part of your human existence, the sort of way you inhabit the world. And I feel like it's a sort of, well, I've been on a journey anyway, I don't want to speak for other, other people are really tuned into the potential of like embodied knowledge. So for me, that's been a real journey, and this commission has facilitated that, and I've been lucky enough to be in part of some really interesting conversations with dancers and movement artists and dance artists. So yeah, I think that appreciation for that, and particularly in a kind of social context, is also really important. And also how it is, like I was talking to some students early today, and I mentioned had forgotten about the criminal justice bill from, 1989 in the UK, the sort of second summer of love, acid house. I mean, I was sort of like very young, wasn't able to participate. But there's sort of, Margaret Thatcher and then John Major's Conservative governments responding to what, rave culture by, in the 90s introducing this criminal justice bill that banned groups of more than 12 gathering and listening to repetitive beats. I mean, it just seems, I mean, that feels like it's like out of the 19th century or so, or I don't know. But anyway, but I'm highlighting this because I think it represents social dance and gathering as a threat. For me, there's a real echoes with that criminal justice bill and the perceived threat of rave culture and, these medieval peasant women dancing in front, challenge to the church, So, all of that I think has made me kind of really live to the agency of dance.
I think that came up in a lot in the conversations, isn't it? That's sort of the way that joy is policed. It's celebrated, the idea of the festival, the carnival, places of release, it's fine. But when it sort of comes out of that, but there's a question in the from the audience, and I think it's a good question, so I want to go straight into it. Is can you talk a little bit about the title of the work? Because I think it does a really good job of sort of summing up a lot of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, the title. Well, it's I should fess up. It is a bit of a riff on. There's a Stevie Wonder song called "Joy Inside My Tears," which I love. But for me, what it summed up as a kind of phrase was this idea of the relationship of joy to pain and sadness. And it reminded me of the sort of funerals, like being sort of like in a state of solidarity and togetherness in remembrance of loss, and the joy in the tears. And also tears, you sometimes you cry when you're happy, obviously, you cry when you're laughing, but we often more associate tears with sadness. So for me, in a phrase, it kind of encapsulated trying to make joy more complex, I think, which it's interesting to kind of, I mean, this is changing the subject now, but I brought some students to see the exhibition on Tuesday, and it's interesting, I think, since some of the reactions to the exhibition, I've been really sort of surprised, actually, about how that's. Sorry.
What, your students who had mixed responses to the show?
No,
Lots of very mixed responses to the show.
Yeah, I mean, I had mixed responses, but like, I didn't want to necessarily talk about this, but this is not the question. But for example, there've been quite a few reviews of the exhibition, and I feel, and this sounds like I'm attacking these reviewers and stuff. I mean, I think, people can say what they want, but what's interesting is that what underlines a lot of the reviews basically is, and sometimes explicitly, is there's this season on happiness, joy and tranquility, and we went to see it, and it wasn't happy. It didn't make us feel happy, or it wasn't particularly joyful, or it wasn't particularly, tranquil, like, what I would regard as, somebody saying, oh, well, Crystal Labasse's work is amazing, but somebody saying, oh, you go to a forest. Why see a work that is depicting a forest when you can go to... And it just made me think, oh my God, this is really interesting, that how, again, this transactionality, for me, a kind of Disneyfication. It's that idea that, you pay like God knows how much it is to go to Disneyland, and then you get to dance with Mickey, and that's your moment of joy, there's that expectation that happiness is delivered, you know? And so for me, it was really interesting. And I mean, I don't know whether, you know, people who've been to see the show, whether the expectation of something that's dealing with these emotions, there's a sense in which you should inhabit those emotions while you're there. And that has taken me completely by surprise. I feel like I've been very naive about that in terms of reading people's expectations. Anyway, sorry, that's
it's interesting. I remember when I was working on the show, we were doing the install, and I was saying to Laurie, it's like the headline is really "The Curators Kill Joy," right? You know, going back to So Ahmed. But it's a show about happiness and positive emotion. It's not necessarily a happy show, but I think it's not necessarily being a particularly happy moment, right? So I think that it's interesting to talk about. But anyway, there's a question here, and I think it's an interesting question. I'm going to go straight into it. So, hi Harold, can you talk a little bit about the facial expressions you and your fellow dancers use in the work? I really like what you said about expectations of happiness, and imagine that this extends to what we are supposed to do with our faces and bodies.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. Facial expressions. Well, some of them.
Your earlier other work as well in the show, Smile.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, Smile.
Sort of interesting relationship between the two works.
Yes, there is. Yes, particularly structured around, I think. So you know, those people that don't know, Smile is a work which is also in the show, an older work. It's about 20 years old, of me trying to hold a smile for as long as possible while listening to Nat King Cole's version of the song Smile. And the lyrics are by Charlie Chaplin. And I'm just holding a smile, and it sort of, it's kind of like becomes quite painful. So there's this relationship between, I think, a kind of action, expression, and duration, and what happens kind of over time. And I think that's possibly linked into the expressions that arose in during the workshop, during the filming. I mean, there's one of the schools that we did, which is has a long history of it within somatic practice, is this shaking. It's one of the ones that sort of Vanya suggested. So like we were, as performers, had to develop these shakes. I can't talk about it without shaking. It's weird anyway. But and then she'd sort of take us through how the shake might be isolated and then be like fully kind of sort of embodied. And then an interesting development was that we had to teach each other our shakes. So we had to learn Samra's or Eben's, Veronica's, which is an interesting thing then to try and embody someone else's. And I think the expressions were crucial to that. So that was the one thing where I was really conscious about other people's expressions. And but yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, with the other school where we're playing dead, there's a sense in which there's this slightly kind of macabre but sort of playful thing of pretending to die, which is something that children do, or and again we would teach each other our different deaths, and it became like a movement vocabulary, and expression sort of came into sort of it there. And I mean, I think particularly in the shaking, there's a really interesting thing about kind of loss of, I was going to say loss of consciousness, but no one collapsed, but like loss of self-awareness. So being very much just in the present moment, being really aware of the potential of the body, feeling the body, and not being aware of anything outside of that. And maybe the expressions somehow kind of mirror that, which is interesting in relation to thinking about being on lockdown and looking at yourself all the time, and and be really conscious of how you're performing or presenting or being transmitted. That kind of loss of that, I think, is really interesting. Again, I'm not sure if I answered that question, but it's really...
I think brilliantly, Harold. It's fascinating. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I just want to ask this final question because I think it's a brilliant question from the audience, and I think we'll have to end it there, unfortunately. So, what is it about dance that's threatening to power? Is it primal? Is it animal? Is the occupation of moving bodies in space inherently political? Let's end with a big one.
Whoa. I want to know who wrote that question. It's a brilliant question. I mean, I think, like, slightly deflecting it. I mean, I think, Barbara Einreich and Lynn Siegel, I think, are addressing some of these. If anyone wants some meaty responses to this question, as opposed to what I might give, I would direct them towards those writers and their publications. But yeah, I mean, I think, we talked a little bit about it before in terms of I think the histories of collective dance and social dance, and that sense in which there's a potential for those things to be spontaneous, to be wild, to be unruly, and that's part of the kind of sort of pleasure of them. What you mentioned before, carnival. Within the kind of Christian tradition, which is obviously just drawing upon these much longer kind of pagan histories, but in a sense that kind of co-opting is about putting that unruliness within a kind of narrative, a framework, so there's this space where you can be unruly, but then it's shut down. It's like, okay, now go back to and I think it's sort of within that sort of kind of potentiality, particularly in, like I say, in the West. I mean, I think there are other forms of kind of collective dance and movement, within different cultural traditions, that I personally think are a bit more sophisticated in terms of, for example, that division that we make between certain practices, it's like you have to have a festival for people to be able to dance in the street. Like, if people just start dancing on like Euston Road collectively, it's like, that's transgressive. It's like, what? And that's because there's a kind of culture of shutting that down. Whereas I think within other traditions, and there are other histories and other practices where, dance and movement and a sort of body knowledge are just, are lived everyday things. So I think, yeah, I mean, I guess that threat to power is about, the need to control people's behavior, and also to sort of structure that in relation to things like productivity. It's not efficient for people just to go off dancing, and it's like, we have to operate in a sort of efficient and productive structure. So for me, yeah, the threat to that is, the potential, for the body to move and to be disobedient, and yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Harold. I mean, a lot of the things that you're talking about are things we've been talking about throughout the research and development of the Commission, and across both exhibitions, and the sense of the emotional, or any form of emotion, whether it's negative or positive, love, anger, hate, is often being denigrated historically. Like certainly within Christian theology, it's rationalism is always elevated. So emotion, any form of emotion, has often been othered, or in terms of whether that's gender or race. So I think that sense of like an overt for showing or display of emotion publicly becomes political, because it's sort of mistrusted and sort of but it's certainly a fascinating history. There was an earlier question about some of the authors that have been mentioned, and we do have a reading list in the guidebook if you go to the exhibition, and I think that's probably online as well on the Wellcome Collection website. But I just sort of want to wrap up. I mean, we could go on. It would be fantastic, but we've got time limits. So thank you very much, Harold. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming and asking those fascinating questions. And if you haven't seen the show, it's still on. I don't have the dates right in front of me, but it's on. I think Joy is on to the end of February next year, and Tranquility is on to the end of January. So we've got this panel discussion is also part of a number of events that are happening over the next few days, and I'm just going to bring up there's a panel discussion tomorrow at 7 o'clock called Social Dance and Traumatic Histories, which is, again, it's free, and there's still some tickets available. So if you've enjoyed the talk tonight, please do book onto that. I'm certainly going to be tuning in and listening to really interesting panelists. So thanks again. Do stay connected with us. With the Wellcome Collection. You can visit the website to book free tickets and find out more about upcoming events, exhibitions, and to explore our collections and digital stories. Thank you very much and have a lovely night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.